Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I was going to say good morning because I'm in San Diego, but we actually have people from all over the place. So it's good evening to some of you, good morning to others, and good day to the rest. I'm Deborah Avant, and I am president of ISA, and I am really happy to welcome you to this third and final panel, our Sapphire Series panel. And I want to start by thanking the organizers for the convention, Erica Chenoweth and Swati Parashar, their assistants, Catherine Rajpura and Fissa Tafara, as well as the ISA staff who've really helped to put this series together. We have an amazing panel today. These panels have been talking about our conference theme, which reflects on the kind of fraught state of our world, and asks people to sort of think about the challenges they see and the opportunities as well. And it's been an amazing set of conversations so far. I expect this one to be even more amazing. We have a tremendous set of panelists from a lot of different perspectives. And so I'm going to turn it over to our illustrious chair, Lauren Wilcox, who will take it from here. I'll turn off my camera and be an audience member, and I really look forward to the conversation. So over to you, Lauren.
All right, thanks so much, Deborah. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really looking forward to hearing what all of these fascinating panelists have to say about some of the very serious questions that were mentioned in the call from here about the kind of high stakes struggles that members of ISA face and how to think about them and how to respond. If you have questions as we go, I think the best thing to do would probably be to put them in the chat. I'm sure you're all familiar with that now, but I suppose if you raise your hand, that I'll probably get to you as well. So we have a good number of panelists, and I'll be asking them to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion after that, which I will chair. So first, we are going to start with Oumar Ba, and Oumar Ba is assistant professor in the Department of Government at Cornell. His primary areas of research focus on law, violence, race, humanity, and world orders in global politics. He's the author of States of Justice, The Politics of the International Criminal Court, which came out of Cambridge in 2020. He's currently working on 2 major projects. The first one, called Crimes, Against Humanity, is a genealogy of the international criminal justice system within the liberal order, highlighting its racialized hierarchy of humanity, and explains current crisis. And the second is titled Recentering Decolonization as Ontology and Sifting Through the Archives of Liberation. Thanks. Oumar, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Professor Wilcox, and it's my honor to share the stage with all of you, and my gratitude to the organizers of the 2023 ISA conference. We were asked to reflect on what we see as the most serious struggles that members of the ISA community face. And I think it's a very difficult question to answer. And for me, especially, the challenge was trying to figure out how I can answer this question without sounding trivial. I mean, the world is burning out there, and millions of people face daily and ongoing violence, including the most brutal forms of colonial violence. So how can I address what I see as some serious struggles of members of our community, the ISA community, without sounding trivial? Also, it's hard to speak of one's challenges or the challenges of one's profession from a position of privilege. And I think I'm speaking here also from a position of privilege. It's true that I'm African. I grew up in Senegal. I went to public schools throughout my whole education, from elementary school to the PhD. I'm a first-gen student, and until very recently, the only people with PhD that I knew was my professors. But still, since we have some how to answer these questions, I'll also try to not repeat what has been shared in the previous panels about the most serious challenges that we face. Therefore, I will try to answer this question by reflecting on questioning itself, since in the line of business that we are in, it's about asking research questions. So I'll mention briefly three things: questions, objectivity, and critique. In his book, Black Skins, a White Mask, Fanon ends with a prayer. That's literally the last sentence of the book, which is a prayer that says, "Oh mon corps fait de moi toujours un homme qui interroge." That is usually translated in English as, "Oh, my body makes of me always a man who asks questions." But I think that's a wrong translation. I think what Fanon actually says is, "Oh, my body makes of me always a man who questions." So a man who questions is not the same as a man who asks questions. The focus here to me is questioning in lieu of asking questions. And this is an invitation, I think, for the ISA community, for the field, the journals, the debates we engage in, the classrooms, how we train the next generation of scholars, for all of us to be more open to questioning as a form of legitimate scholarship, not just asking research questions, but questioning itself. Some of us are able to conduct research with a cool, detached sense, and from a position of objectivity, quote unquote. Some of us cannot do that because we're deeply invested in that which we study, and we are not just motivated by intellectual curiosity. There's a deeper sense of why we ask the questions that we ask and why we must question that which we research. So some of us do engage in questioning because the stakes are quite high, and we question a lot of concepts that tend to be Eurocentric, a lot of ideas, arguments, and epistemologic questions that we take as granted, as settled. And in that sense, this is an invitation, I think, for the ISS community to be, and for the field in general, to be more hospitable to insurgent forms of scholarship, to questioning research and not just asking research questions, and to critique as a method. And I would end here with a quote from the historian Robin D.G. Kelly, who says, I quote, "It's really important for me to make no pretense about some kind of dispassionate, detached objectivity. I think that we need to practice something that's even better than objectivity, and that is critique. Critique to me is better than objectivity. Objectivity is a false stance. I'm not neutral. I've never been neutral. I write about struggles and social movements because I actually don't think the world is right and something needs to change," end quote. And I'll leave you with that quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Oumar. Next, we have Z Alboudisi. Z is a professor of international politics at Sciences Po Rabat, and she's the author of the book Dignity in the Egyptian Revolution, Demands, Protests. That's from Cambridge University in 2001. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren, for the introduction, and also very happy to be here with this great panel, and it was so inspiring to hear from Oumar Ba on these important points. So just a little update. I'm currently at New York University, Abu Dhabi. So I mean, yeah, this is really, recent. I'm gonna answer a question earlier on by our very dear Sarah Dorr, who's been very helpful, of course, in organizing these virtual events. And that is that actually I'm still waiting for my visa for the Montreal Convention. So talking about struggles, and I wanted to start with that. And well, obviously, it's a struggle for many in our ISA community. I'm really sorry for all those who had to withdraw, and I'm hoping for the best who are still waiting like me. And now back to the questions that motivate here this discussion. So maybe some great issues to think about. And I will talk about two. So first, human rights inequality and a cognitive dissonance of policymaking, or simply put, inadequate policymaking. To me, a first serious issue is here the human rights inequality globally, but I'm talking from my position more specifically, and also my research focus, that is the Global South, and more specifically the Arab region. I think it's obvious, and I think it also speaks to the point of Oumar, that maybe some of these things are trivial, and of course I apologize, but actually human rights inequality is really a serious issue, and that it is not addressed enough, right? So it's there, but it's the problem is that it's not addressed enough. We clearly don't have an annual COP, right, on it. So luckily, we at least have one on climate change. And this human rights inequality is particularly a dichotomy between global North and global South. And it's on things like the inability to contend a decision, to dispute a rejection, to have legal resources, or when there is differentiated legal treatment, de jure or de facto, so explicitly or implicitly. And this human rights inequality is also about the deficit in the rule of law, again, particularly in the global South, which is quite staggering in the case of the Arab region. In such cases of deficit of legal resources, what many locals resort to do is use international law, even as local citizens. And note, of course, here that the use of international law comes in handy for refugees and migrants in these global South countries. For this first issue, I would like to rely on two works. So mine on the demands of dignity in the 2011 revolution in Egypt, and broadly in the Arab uprisings for the region. The demands were for bread, justice, notably social justice, عدالة اجتماعية, and most importantly, to me, the demands came from a sense of outrage because of a level of helplessness, powerlessness, as an individual in your own country, meaning that we, the people, don't really matter as political forces when we know that we matter. When it comes to the economy, to security, to intelligence, to migration, and so on. Not addressing this deficit, so of the rule of law, is a social time bomb. The second work is by constitutional expert Zaynab, who thinks that the next wave of revolutions in the region is still coming and is going to be about constitutional change. Al-Ali is, in his book on the matter, looked at 10 countries in the region since 2011 that went through these constitutional changes. And it's worth noting that this was a considerable wave of these pretty much simultaneous constitutional reforms that compares to the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So a very important event. However, most of these reforms have been disappointing and actually concentrated power to legally strengthen the ruling regimes as opposed to empower the people. The second issue that I would like to discuss comes from my teaching of public policy and me trying to critically think about it from a Global South perspective, and most importantly, with a Global South audience, my students. And of course, also here recognizing our privileges. My remark is that there is a cognitive dissonance of the policymaking process in the Global South, because the goals of policymaking in these places are often outward looking and serve foreign interests. However, they are narrated to the public as a matter of local interests with a discourse of nationalism and development. And that actually becomes what many people start to believe. For example, policies around the markets, migration, and labor are often directly connected to external security needs, including food security. So I'm here thinking, for example, of the policymaking in the southern Mediterranean countries and how they serve the European Union, for example. And this policymaking may benefit, so here thinking about maybe how to think forward, may benefit from becoming more inward looking. So I wanted also to give one example of maybe here how we can promote legal reform in the Global South to address this two issues of human rights inequality and maybe inadequacy of public policy making. And this can be done in as many ways as possible. So, I mean, that can take a lot of time, but I think, for example, I want to talk about one example of halal certification regulation that's in the EU. So this is coming from my work right now, but also because I think it's an interesting example that could be attractive since it serves both an interest of markets, but also addresses the issue of marginalization and discrimination. The EU has been quite sort of resisting under the pretext that this is sort of a barrier to markets, when actually it's a form of protection of consumers, right? So that's something that could be, for instance, an example there. And I'll stop here. Sorry about taking too long.
No worries. Thank you very much, Z. Certainly lots to think about here. I'm going to turn next to May Darwish. And May is Senior Lecturer in International Relations of the Middle East in the Department of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Birmingham. Her research attempts to bring Middle East cases to debates within IR theory, while surmounting the challenge to the study of state behavior in the Middle East through theoretical lenses. And she's the author of Threats and Alliances in the Middle East, Saudi and Syrian Policies in a Turbulent Region. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and thank you for inviting me. I believe this discussion is extremely important because, again, with everything that's happening around us in the world, all the challenges and the risks, especially in the Global South, they're actually encroaching on our research, our teaching, and everything we do as an ISA community. And allow me to highlight two main dynamics which personally keep me very worried during these important times. I think the first issue with all the risks and the challenges that we see in the current world order, the most important consequence of that on researchers, including especially researchers working on the Global South, is the fact that authoritarianism, wars, civil wars, instability have had a large impact on our research question: what can we study and what we can't study? And obviously, the main risk is that more and more issues and more cases are becoming less accessible to researchers everywhere. So debates within our discipline are not necessarily driven by the significant research question, the important issues that we need to study, but they're increasingly being shaped by questions of access and feasibility and what we can study at the moment. And obviously, this is concerning, because when we talk about the academy and policy and how there is constant disconnect from both communities not able to communicate properly, this is increasingly going to be happening because researchers are unable to catch up with all of these changes, but increasingly unable to study some of the most important phenomenon that's happening around us and that concern humanity in general. So this has been at least one of the main challenges of scholars in the Middle East, me including other scholars as well, working in other regions of the global South. And unfortunately, this is only going to keep increasing in the next few years. So this is mainly my concern. What are those questions? What are those debates in the discipline? To what extent they're reflecting the main challenges that the world is currently facing? It's a very important issue. The second, with all that's been happening in the global South, unfortunately, one of the main consequences is the increase in inequality, economic inequality, but also inequality in education, equality in training for younger generations. Currently, our community is facing issues and questions about diversity, about decolonization, about inclusivity of different scholars, different voices from the global South. I think this is only going to be even more challenging in the future with the current crises and current problems, civil wars happening in different parts of the global South. Education is not really a priority at the moment. Less investment in education in many parts of the world. And obviously the gap between the level and the standard of education in the global North and the global South is only increasing. And we see that in student recruitment, we see it in research, we also see it in publications, in funding. So this is increasingly becoming a problem. And what worries me is that as an ISA community, we don't really have the tools, the discipline doesn't have the tools, even our institutions do not have a tool to overcome these gaps, which are increasing day by day. So obviously, when we talk about grants, funding, different sort of opportunities that we engage with others, we're partners in the global South, there is constant challenges that are coming ahead. And obviously, as an ISA community, I think we're not talking about this enough. We're not debating these issues enough, and we're not trying to find ways to overcome these increasing challenges. So I believe many of the issues, many of the crisis and the risks that the current world order is facing is having a significant impact on our work, on our community. And obviously, I would just limit my comments to these two main issues, but there are obviously many, many more issues that we can also reflect on in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, May. There's a lot really on the table here already about just how much the world affects, how we do our research as a community and what kinds of questions and questioning is enabled or disenabled through this, and hoping to pick this up some more. Next, we have Matt Hoffmann, who is professor of political science at the University of Toronto Scarborough and co-director of the Environmental Governance Lab at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. His research on decarbonization, climate change, and environmental politics has been published in 4 books and over 50 journal articles and book chapters. Thanks very much, Matt.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. This is a really wonderful conversation, and I'll continue the theme of questioning, I think, and thinking along those lines. And my questioning always comes around climate change, what I can't avoid thinking about even in the middle of the night. And so what I tried to do was think about some of the challenges for the ISA community that come from climate change and what it means for the kind of scholarship we do, not just for those of us that study climate change, but what the impacts of climate change are going to have potentially on across our community. And so I'm just going to really briefly outline what I see as 4 challenges for scholarship and 2 challenges for teaching, because also we've not fully engaged, I think, yet with teaching. So first challenge, and I will also say at the outset, I know more about the challenges than I do about solutions. So I apologize at the outset for that. First challenge, there's actually no politics outside of climate change. Because climate change is now a defining feature of the global system. That doesn't mean that everybody has to study climate change, but it does mean that we are in a climate constrained world. And the impact of this is that our political institutions, domestic and international, as well as our IR theories, were all developed in a different geologic era. They were all developed in the Holocene, a relatively calm climactic era. And I know that our political institutions are not well suited for the current geologic era of the Anthropocene, but it's actually an open question whether our IR theories can help us make sense of global dynamics in this new geologic era. And so I would say that this is a call to question, as Oumar called us to, the sort of very fundamental perspectives and lenses we bring to try and make sense of the world. Second, climate change is not just a governance challenge, it's an inequality machine. It takes in existing intersectional inequalities and injustice, whether that's along the lines of race, class, or gender, and it takes those in and it outputs exacerbated inequalities and injustices. The iron law of climate change is that those that are least responsible for causing the problem are those most facing the most significant challenges from the problem. And this isn't just a challenge for those that study climate change, right? Because there's inextricable links between climate change and justice and equity. And the more I study this, the more I'm convinced that it's not really possible to address climate change without sort of inextricably linking it to justice and equity concerns. But it's actually, in a climate constrained world, difficult, if not impossible, to really pursue justice and equity effectively and to understand it and make sense of it from a scholarly sense without bringing to bear notions of climate change. Third challenge from climate change is that the scope of necessary transformation that we need in the next 4-5 decades is massive, fast, and conscious. And humanity's not awesome at that to begin with, and scholars and academics are terrible at that as a part of humanity. And I think that this has implications for all the issues that climate change touches and is touched by. We're in an era where we have to react consciously, and we have to react fast, and we have to undertake massive transformations of our societies, economies, and energy systems. And I'm not convinced that our academics, our scholarship is yet ready or has fully countenanced the enormity of this task. Fourth challenge for scholarship is the moral necessity of engaged scholarship on climate change. And similar to all the calls that my colleagues have been making already, I'll be a little provocative and say there shouldn't be academic only questions on climate change. If you're asking questions that only matter to other academics on climate change, you're doing it wrong. This isn't to mean that you shouldn't still do rigorous research. Absolutely, that is our value added. But it needs to be in the service of enhancing the just and equitable transition to a low carbon world. All right, I'm running short on time, so I'm just going to leave that one out sort of hanging. But 2 challenges for teaching. And I think that this is something I think a lot about. How do I teach about an existential crisis when I'm in the midst of an existential crisis? And that comes down to the question, or how do you answer the question, how do you tell the truth to students without generating paralyzing despair? And so focusing on sources of uncertainty and agency and empowerment are things that I and some of my colleagues try and do. Framing the obstacles to change as the foundation for moving forward. But I think that we really need to take into account the fact that not only do we feel all of these crises that we're talking about, but our students feel them at a really existential level and are worried about the even possibility of their futures. And I think we have an obligation to take that into account in our pedagogical thinking. Finally, this isn't really a challenge, but is sort of a call. A friend and colleague, Harriet Bulkley, who studies climate change, talks a lot about hope as a practice in teaching. And the notion that in our scholarship and our teaching, despair is not really ethically defensible, especially for academics and academics in the global north who have a choice because of privilege. But working for a just and equitable path to a low carbon world is a long-term, generational, epic endeavor. It's not something that's going to be won in a policy or treaty. It's an orientation to the world. And I think that bringing that to our students is something we should think about how to do. Let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt. I think this question of kind of how do we go about teaching when the world is all burning down in so many ways, I think one that resonates with a lot of people, and it certainly resonates with me. Like, how do we kind of go forward, and how do we, and how do we kind of frame things for our students in all of this? Next, we have Abe Newman, who is professor in the Edwin A. Walsh School of Foreign Service and Government Department at Georgetown University. His research focuses on the ways in which economic interdependence and globalization have transformed international politics. And he has a new book coming out this fall with Henry Farrell called Underground Empire: How America Weaponized the World Economy. Thanks, Abe.
Thanks very much, Lauren. I'm going to add to the pylon of sad, I'll call it, that this panel is currently addressing, but hopefully maybe I'll give a uplifting point at the end, because I am an optimist at heart. So my theme is, for me, it's like it's a personal, kind of deeply troubling exercise of what my own research is like unleashing, or what it's letting me see in the world. That is, it's very troubling, which is for the last several years, I've been focusing on how globalization has become a weapon that states are using against each other to kind of seek their interests. And a main theme of that has been the ways in which technology and innovation are creating vulnerabilities and not just opportunities. And so I think the world that a lot of us were raised in, I think it raises like a challenge for our field, because we were kind of bought into this version, I would call it, of like the neoliberal spin that said, we're all going to get richer from globalization, everything was going to be hunky-dory, So there's like an academic and a theory, and we got to put our heads together how we understand that. But I feel now it's much more. I get a creeping kind of fear about what this portends for research collaborations globally, how we think about innovation and mentoring students, how we work with students, which students we pick, how we think about our interactions with colleagues internationally. Just a small anecdote is that for several years, I was involved in a collaboration on technology issues with scholars from China. And it was so, nobody cared. It was like something that was so below the radar. It was a technical topic, mobile phone, innovation. And as soon as the Trump ZTE order was leveraged against Chinese firms, it became a highly contentious and something that, I got a lot out of that collaboration and that interaction. And I know my Chinese colleagues did as well. And that was for me, it's just the tip of the iceberg. And I feel it happening in so many other domains. The Jake Sullivan announcement that we're in an absolute race for technological supremacy versus China. It's a very bold statement that has, I think, radical implications for how a whole, not just political scientists, but the whole scientific field can think about engaging with the world. And sitting here in Berlin, I can tell you that people are really worried what's going to happen to how global science happens. These networks that were based on what would you call an open innovation architecture, that is being seen by policymakers as a threat, but I think also potentially within academic communities as a big uncertainty. So I think that it's really important for communities like the ISA to think about how to contain these worries and these threats so that they do not spiral out of control. We had during the Cold War a lot of academic exchange across borders and boundaries, and we had ways to maintain openness even when there was conflict and concern. And I think that people, myself included, have not really, we're not prepared for, I'd say, the suddenness with which technology, innovation, science has become a vulnerability. And so we as a community are not really prepared to defend and fight for the maintenance of that collaboration. And I don't want to say there aren't risks and there aren't vulnerabilities, and we should definitely prepare for those things, and we should be critical about where, that we need to be safe. I think that's great. But we also have to have a very strong argument for protecting our students and protecting our fellow colleagues in other countries, and how we can maintain these links. And I think if we don't, not only will science and knowledge suffer, but our friends and people that we rely on for our own life and sustenance. So I think my general call is that we need to really wake up and see that technology and science itself is being viewed increasingly as a source of threat and vulnerability, and we as scientists need to create a strong community to defend it.
Thanks so much, Abe. Next, we have Manuela Picq, who is senior lecturer in the departments of political science and sexuality, women's and gender studies at Amherst College, and professor of international relations at Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador. She's the author of scholarly books and articles, including Vernacular Sovereignties, Indigenous Women Challenging World Politics. And in 2021, she led the presidential campaign of water defender Yaku Perez for the indigenous party Picq in Ecuador. Thanks, Manuela.
Hi. So I'm going to pick up on Oumar's and Matthew's comments on engaged scholarship and expand on Fanon's point on the body and what we do with our bodies. So the question I want to ask is the relevance of our discipline, which is not a new question. It's a very old question. But I'll start with an experience. Last fall, I live in Ecuador on indigenous territories. And I've been working with indigenous communities to defend the mountains and the waters that flow from the Andes into the Amazon from Chinese corporations, which, as Zaynab mentioned, it's international politics disguised as national politics of development. And when we went to court with these very poor communities, most people are illiterate, I reached out to my colleagues and asked for amicus curiae for the case, right, about the rights of nature, the climate crisis, the rights of indigenous communities, corporate free dynamics, etc. And some contributed amicus curiae, but many did not. Some told me they didn't have time because they were going on vacation. Others were going to conferences in Italy, so they didn't have time. And others said that it was not their style. So implicitly telling me that their style is knowledge production and not activism, I suppose. So the question I want to ask and call ourselves on and our discipline is, what is knowledge and what do we do with our knowledge, right? Is knowledge production relevant if it fails to engage with the world we inhabit, if it fails to support the communities we work with? Is it useful to think the rights of nature and to publish about the right of nature, or to write about the climate crisis and corporate free colonial dynamics if we fail to act upon them when given the opportunity? So I got very upset with that event, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not going to the ISA this year. I'm only participating in this panel because I got a little deeply disappointed with how we practice our discipline and what we do with our knowledge, because we develop a lot of beautiful critical thinking, but we're not willing to allocate time for it or for the communities in need. So we're not very willing to leave the ivory tower and practice what we preach, to engage to turn theory into practice, which is actually much more difficult than it looks at first sight. So in a nutshell, I would say that the problem that I want to bring up is that our bodies do not always and often do not stand in nearly enough by our ideas. And I think it's a particular problem to international relations, even though it's a problem across academia at large. But because in IR we think the global, the international, we have a tendency to forget that the international is anchored into the local. So how do we allocate our time? How do we set priorities? And the idea or the challenge that I came up with is, can there be a public IR? How can we be at the service of the communities we work with and move beyond the critical thinking, or take the critical thinking into action? Because critical thinking that limits itself to knowledge production in the ivory tower ceases to be critical. To talk about methodologies and the questioning that Oumar mentioned. So there's the how and the why. I think the how, beyond the individuals who don't have time, it's because they live within institutional structures that only value certain forms of academic service, right? And that rank publications. So if we have academic service for peer review, why not for court cases? Why not for engaged scholarship? Why does academia value and rewards theoretical thinking and publication so much more than activist and grounded work? So that's something that's very archaic in academia, in our discipline in particular, and that reproduces inequalities. And I would say that it fuels the irrelevance of international relations, right, for communities that don't see much use of it. So as a concrete example, last year, I work frequently with migrants, right, who need asylum, Latin American migrants, Ecuadorians in particular, to get them out of jail. Many did come out of jail last year. That's absolutely invisible in my CV and not valued by my institution. After 7 years of legal struggles at the UN, the third recognized indigenous marriage in Ecuador, and that was a major international legal precedent, absolutely invisible in my CV. So how do we make academia value activism to actually have engaged scholarship become a practice, a common practice? And then there's the why. I think at first, why doing that and why moving towards engaged scholarship urgently and fast, to quote Matthew, right? Massively, consciously, and fast. It's because there is a gap between what we preach and what we do in terms of the climate crisis. In particular, indigenous communities are completely abandoned by our discipline, and it's on their territories that the future of the planet is being played. There's a gap between scholars of the global north and the global south. Everybody who's in the global south know that it's a privilege to live in the ivory tower that we do not have in the global south. We have to do politics. It's absolutely impossible not to do so. And we often pay with our lives. But you know, even to go back to theory, practice transforms theory, and theory transforms practice. So we need to be connected with practice to actually do good theory. And the ideas we have, they shape the international order from the bottom up. So it's actually really important to take them out there. So in closing, I will pose the question of, why do we do what we do, and for whom do we do it, right? Are we publishing and developing theories to climb institutional ladders and publication rankings, or are we pushing critical perspectives to actually take them into the world and change the global order from the bottom up? And indigenous people say that maybe the main goal of indigenous perspectives nowadays and activism is to restore all of our relations. In North America, there's the 7 generations principle, but this notion of restoring relations between humans and non-humans and beyond the human. And I think academia and international relations in particular has to focus on restoring all of its relations urgently.
Thank you so much. That was really great. And our final panelist today is Swati Srivastava, and she is assistant professor of political science at Purdue University. She researches private actors in global governance, and her book, Hybrid Sovereignty in World Politics, explores how sovereign power is expressed through non-state actors such as security contractors, business associations, and NGOs. And she's currently working on a project on the global politics of big tech. Right, Swati?
Thank you. It's great to be here. Always great to go last after a bunch of awesome people have made their comments. Well, I think I'll just, it's been really inspiring to hear these comments, thinking about especially cleavages between global North and South. And this is something that has become more important to me in my research. Even though I'm a scholar that was born in the South and then educated in the North, it's become quite evident to me how much we ignore a lot of questioning in the South based on my North-centric training. But I want to focus a little bit about the main issue that I see us facing is not necessarily one specific challenge that we've talked about in terms of issue areas. I think we've put a lot on the table of SAD, as they've talked about, but really how we actually address these challenges. And to me, I've been focusing a lot on tech and AI recently. And the thing that scares me about this is not just thinking about, what ChatGPT might do to our students' learning. I think that's important, but really how certain kinds of machine learning might impact human learning. And certain kinds of tech creativity might disable human creativity. And these are the questions that I'm really grappling with today. We already see this in our fight for attention in the surveillance capitalism economy. That things have to go viral, things have to be engaged in certain ways. And we're seeing a version of that kind of filter into academic scholarship about hot takes and fast scholarship and trying to be a first mover and claim a territory and claim a space. It's no longer enough to publish, you have to now promote, right? Otherwise, how do we know people will read this work? And I think this kind of attention-based economy, which is about creating viral content, right? Thinking about what's knowledge, right? Calling us as content creators really changes the ideas of knowledge. So I think that's one aspect that I've been struggling with as somebody who's who's more of a slow scholar, slow scholarship, right? I write not in sort of ways that I think are being rewarded by the discipline. And so that's something that we have to think about is how we engage slowly and deeply with issues in a fast-moving world that requires our attention and engagement. But a lot of policy and activist work don't have, right, a year of peer review to wait for stuff to come out, right? They need our attention now. And so I think that's really important that we do that. But I think a lot of academics are really hesitant to engage that without they've done the careful work of thinking through issues. So how do we kind of marry the fast-paced challenges of the world with the more slower-paced methods of academia is something that I've been struggling with. And to relate to that again is how we have sort of access issues of how do we study issues of power, right? So I can't walk into Facebook and demand them to let me into their archives. Right? And yet this is a powerful company that needs to be studied. And as Z mentioned, these issues of access are happening around the world in other contexts too. This is not just about corporations, but governments too. And as did May, right, about these issues about access to research. So I think as tech becomes more and more invisible, and Abe has done a great job showing us these different ways in which invisible infrastructures govern technology, researchers are not going to be able to access those invisible structures of tech, and we're not going to be able to link how those tech structures are influencing the way we think, the way we research, the way we teach. And that is something that really scares me, is how our attention is being captured for certain ways and monetized in certain ways, whether or not we are on social media a long time. But also I'm worried about the kinds of research and teaching that might be made possible because of this limited attention span, because people are doing things behind the scenes that are not visible, and because ultimately it might lead to more fragmentation around the world. And so again, not really something that has easy solutions, but I think emphasizing creativity in thinking, in reasoning, in sort of teaching, making sure that we are aware that we are informed by these technical structures, that our attention is being weaponized in certain ways, that this idea of viral content is playing a role in how sort of researchers get published and get recognized, get noticed, and all of those things are layered with biases and discrimination. I think all of that has to play a role in what we mean by, I timed myself, in what we mean by empowering academics and students, because these are all really important challenges that you put on the table. And I worry that a lot of the way that tech is moving might not help us solve these problems if we're not careful about it. So I'll pause there, but again, thank you for the great conversation that came before.
Okay, thank you, Swati, and thank you everybody on this panel for such a, I don't come away from being depressed at all. I think this is a lot that's really on the table, and I see a lot of kind of, strong connections, but also some tensions, perhaps in what people are saying. So I don't have any questions in the chat yet. I would really recommend that people put them in there, and including panelists, you are more than welcome to put some questions in the chat as well. But perhaps I'll start with one a thing that I noticed, and something that resonates with me as well. While I sort of teach and publish around international relations, most of my teaching is in gender studies, and but I kind of find similar things here in IR as we do in gender studies. And one of them is some of the tensions, again, between the really fierce urgency of now, right, as I think of it. That's what's been expressed here. There's a lot in the world that is very seriously going wrong. So I have students very affected by a kind of global far right wing kind of anti-gender movement insurgency, the sort of anti-trans politics of the UK and all sorts of things about this, in which there is this need to sort of speak, to do something, right? To kind of enact and be active in this. And then what do we, and we could kind of think of any number of issues, of course, like what Matt brought up with climate change or various forms of violences and inequalities around the world that are affecting so many people from this. And we know there's quite a bit going wrong, but how do we also marry that or think about that in what kind of makes academics and academia unique, which is something which I kind of want to push my students as well, is to sort of be able to think kind of above and beyond and around that some way, right? To sort of think more slowly, to think about what's the background, how can we avoid being captured by the frame, right, as it were, about this? How can we develop new forms of critical knowledge and insights in ways that I don't know, might not seem directly relevant to the exact pressures, but are still really necessary to be doing the kind of thinking and work, and to kind of make us into people who are able to do this somehow. So I don't know if that is something that speaks to any of you as well from this. I'll also kind of pose to the panel Manuela's question to Oumar. Manuela writes, critique is better than objectivity, you say. Can we dismantle the myth of objectivity? So I'll let the panelists, if you want to maybe raise your hands or maybe just kind of unmute yourselves and go for it, I guess.
Thank you for this good question. I'll try to be brief. Of course, I'm all for dismantling the myth of objectivity. And I like that you call it a myth, because I totally agree that there is so much fetishization of objectivity in our field, in our academic work and discourse, when in reality, even if objectivity were something we could achieve, then the question is, to what end? What's the need of being objective in your research? And I don't think actually this is something we can achieve at all. So why not just do away with the pretense and acknowledge that we all address this question, that we develop a research agenda from a specific point, which may be different from for each of us, but in any case, we cannot engage the world with an objective stance. Now, some of us would engage in some research that is quite distanced from their own daily preoccupations. Others are much closer to what they study or why they choose to study that. But in any case, I think objectivity blurs our thinking if we are trying to address this question from a pretension that we have to be objective in what we write and how we write about it.
Thanks. We have another question that kind of continues on some of this discussion from Pastor Bueno, who writes, how can we nurture radical imagination in our pedagogy in the face of the sense of an apocalyptic present/future? Somebody want to take that one on? Matt.
I don't know that I'll take it on, but I could talk about an experience I've had. That's a question I face every semester when I'm figuring out my syllabus for thinking about teaching climate politics. And so one thing that I think is possible is for us to look outside of international relations. And so just as an example, this past semester, I co-taught a class with an English professor on climate imaginaries, where we specifically brought together sort of political science ideas on scenarios and the political dynamics that are both obstacles and opportunities for change with novels, with climate fiction, and not the apocalyptic climate fiction, but climate fiction that at least had some possibilities of a future that wasn't terrible. And we had the students, the main assignment for that class was for the students to write a memoir or a short story set in 2050. So, and thinking about, and they engaged in world building, they engaged in this sort of imagination based on what they learned about politics and political science and what's possible and things along these lines. But not being limited to what we generally teach international relations is why everything's so hard. And so this is one, I guess, my simple answer to that question in terms of nurturing this radical imagination is to be bold in our own and be a little bit braver in our own pedagogical thinking, to think that maybe we should be moving outside of international relations.
I'll add up to that. I always tell my students, try to imagine a new color and they'll tell me the new color. And of course, it's the difficulty of imagining something different that you don't know. But also, even if you're able to imagine, how do you tell it, right? And the politics of translation. And I always, to try to find that space of radical imagination, I always take them to indigenous worldviews, not because indigenous peoples are perfect or like not to fall into the romanticization, but stepping outside of IR, stepping outside of the state, right? Of spaces that have been so institutionalized and enclosed, to imagine other ways of being, loving, relating, other methodologies, and bringing feeling, right? And these multiple relations beyond the human, how can they nurture the radical?
Yeah, part of what I've been doing is giving more practical assessments. So they read privacy policies of products they use every day. They kind of score it on the base of something, and then they write back to the companies and ask them to change parts of the policies. Right. And because I think part of surveillance capitalism is you feel like, whatever, who reads these things, just like, agree, and we don't have a say in it. And actually giving students a say in it and saying, they might not change it, but somebody has to listen to these things. And you can read these policies, you can understand what's going on. I also just don't teach the isms as much. I think a lot of it is not useful for how my undergrads think about the world. So we read a lot of stuff that's long form journalism. We read things that are written by people around the world about the problems that they're facing. And I don't think they need to read what people wrote 60, 70 years ago about a world that no longer exists. But I think that's useful as well.
Thanks. This is all really interesting. And I've kind of have so many questions. I was wondering, again, if we couldn't also think more about, in the broad ways in which that so many of you have spoken so eloquently about the ways in which kind of the world and what's going on in so many parts of the world, deeply affects the kind of scholarship that not only, you know, does IR devalue some kinds of scholarship, or does that kind of academia in general, but just literally quite limits kind of the community and kind of the things we could do. I'm thinking about sort of some of the points that Z and May brought up about, you know, forms of access as well. So we kind of have this, sort of, you know, I'm thinking the difference kind of the temporal, like how are we thinking about the future and kind of, and relating to the past work in IR, but then also how do we think about what we might call a sort of spatial aspect of IR as well, and kind of, and that has to do more with when what's going on in certain parts of the world, again, are kind of affecting you know, literally the kind of work that can be done. Maybe Abe or May or others would want to speak to this point.
Well, I'll just very briefly just say I think it's so important to get out into the world. You know, it's like getting our students out into the world, whether it's through study abroads or through, you know, collaboration with researchers in other communities. I fear that too much we just kind of like hunker down in our chairs, and then we don't see, you know, what are the eyes of another perspective that we could learn from. And so I think the more that we can continue that, even as the world faces all these challenges, I think it's going to be really important.
Maybe if I can add, so very much agree with Swati's point on maybe not trying to focus too much on theory, so depending on courses, using case studies, relying on diversity of positionality of authors. I think that's also very important. For instance, in looking at public policy, I found that I think students respond well to, for instance, guest speakers that I am able sometimes to bring to class, and who are not academics, so who actually come from activist backgrounds, and it's really refreshing also to have these sort of resources to, I think, maybe open up the pedagogical possibilities.
Thank you. Thanks. So I'm not sure how much time we have left here for this. We've kind of gone over a little bit. Does anybody else have any other burning questions, or should we kind of treat this as, you know, I guess for me, the best panel is always kind of where you're left with more questions, right, than you have answers, perhaps. But I'm very grateful to have been able to be a part of this, and very grateful for Deborah and the program chairs for inviting me and kind of setting this up, and for Sarah and everybody behind the scenes who's been organizing this. Deborah, did you want to say a couple words in closing?
No, just thank you. This has been amazing. I'm working on my my address for Thursday night, and I have to say that I will be quoting many of you. So anyway, thank you for such a great conversation, and for so, you know, engaging so deeply in the field. I really appreciate it, and in the world. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.